Claire Whitaker only meant to stop by her late foster mother's old wooden cabin, lock the door, pack a few things, and leave. But behind a loose board near the fireplace, she found something that made her freeze, a child's letter scrawled in red crayon. "The bus never came back. If you see this, you have to come." At the bottom was a single name, Claire, no last name, no date. The handwriting looked strange yet hauntingly familiar. Wind hissed through the cracks in the wall, sounding almost like children laughing, and one question echoed in her mind. Who's calling me back, and why now? Claire Whitaker hadn't planned to stay long. This trip home was nothing more than an obligation clearing out the old cabin her foster mother, Agnes, had left behind after she passed away. Claire had lived in Charlotte for the past 10 years, working as a community therapist, a rational, practical job, but this forest, it never played by rational rules. The cabin sat quietly among ancient pines, its walls covered in moss and years of wind. Agnes had once been a nurse at Ash Hollow boarding school until the school shut down. After that, she lived alone, spoke little, and avoided visitors. Claire had always thought it was just age. Now she wasn't so sure while gathering old books near the fireplace. Claire's hand struck a soft spot on the wall, a rotted board that suddenly popped loose. Behind it was a narrow hollow, and inside a small, folded sheet of paper, its surface stained with dirt and time. Unfolding it, Claire saw childish handwriting in red crayon. "The bus never came back. If you see this, you have to come." At the bottom was the name Claire again, no last name, no date. The letters were clumsy and uneven, yet something about them felt familiar, unsettlingly so. A half-forgotten memory stirred a dream from her childhood, one that had recurred for years. A little boy standing in the woods, hand raised, waving his mouth, calling something she could never quite. Now she could. It was a voice calling from somewhere deeper. The next morning, Claire took the paper to the town library. The librarian, a silver-haired woman named Mrs. Kellerman, glanced at the note and pushed it back. "Old story," she said flatly. "No one remembers anymore." Claire looked up. "Has anyone ever reported missing children around 1996? Maybe from Ash Hollow School?" Mrs. Kellerman frowned. "That year, some people from out of town came asking questions, but no one saw anything. Then they disappeared too. Best you let the past rest, dear." "Out of town, you mean the police?" The librarian lowered her voice, eyes darting toward the shelves. "No, not the police. They weren't in uniform. Asked a few questions, then said there was no evidence, no files, no names, and that was that." Claire took the note, stood up, and left, driving back to the cabin. She checked her rearview mirror and suddenly felt someone was following her. No car, no headlights, no one on the road. Only the trees, only the wind, and somewhere in the back of her mind that same whisper again. "If you see this, you have to come." That night, Claire opened her laptop on the cabin's kitchen table. The blue light flickered against the low wooden ceiling, flashing with every gust that rattled the window panes. She typed into the search bar, "Ash Hollow School 1996, missing children, North Carolina." Nothing, just a few scattered articles about the school's financial closure. Claire opened Ancestry, a site her foster mother had once used for medical records. She'd never cared for genealogy, but this time she typed her name, Claire Whitaker. A profile appeared, incomplete, no father, mother unknown. But under family connections, one name was listed as a placeholder. James Whitaker, brother, sibling, no photo, just one entry line. Ash Hollow School, student ID missing, last record 1996. Claire felt her heartbeat slow. She took a screenshot, printed it, and drove to the town records office the next morning. The clerk, a man in his 60s with a wrinkled shirt and a cup of cold coffee, greeted her with a tired look. "Could you help me verify an old student record? Ash Hollow 1996, she asked. He glanced at the printout. "That's an old name. That school's nothing but dust now. Could you still check?" He pulled out a ledger, flipped through a few pages, and stopped. "No such name," he said curtly, avoiding eye contact. Claire noticed his hand resting loosely on a paper stamped with a faded red seal. Then, "May I see the bus roster from that year?" He exhaled, lowered his voice. "Let me give you some advice. Not every file's meant to be found. Some things get lost for a reason, best to leave them that way." Claire stood still for a few seconds, then folded the paper and turned to leave. "Be careful," he added. "Not every town likes being stirred up." That night in the cabin, Claire received an anonymous email. No subject line, no sender address, only 6 words in the body text. "Stop, for your own sake." Claire hadn't planned on returning to the old school. But after the anonymous email, she knew she no longer had a choice. The next morning, just after sunrise, she loaded Max into the car with a flashlight, gloves, her ancestry printout, and the crumpled child's letter. Woods behind Ash Hollow School were dense and overgrown, thick enough to cut the GPS signal completely. Crumbled stone steps, collapsed fences, moss-soaked silence. Nothing about this place looked like it had ever been a school. Then she saw it. A rusted school bus, its frame almost entirely swallowed by moss and vines, leaned to one side as if time and guilt had dragged it halfway into the earth. No license plate, no school logo, no light. Just presence. Max growled low, ears pinned back. His spine bristled. Claire tightened the leash and stepped forward. Inside the bus, beams of sunlight cut through shattered windows like knives. Seats torn, foam split open. Rusted lunchboxes were scattered across the floor, and near the center aisle a small metal badge, round half, buried in dust. She picked it up. Engraved, though barely visible. Ash Hollow, Grade 5. Max started pawing at the floor beneath the last bench. Claire knelt, brushed away layers of dead leaves, and saw a glint of metal. She pulled it free. A hospital ID bracelet still intact, etched clearly. Agnes Whitaker, RN, staff 047, 1996. Claire froze. Agnes had never mentioned the bracelet. Why was it here? Her fingers closed tightly around the band. Her breath came short. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind swept through the bus. Dead leaves spun in the aisle. And then a sound brushed past her ear. Soft, delicate, like a child's laughter. Claire held her breath. No one there, just the wind. "You're imagining things," she told herself. She turned toward the back window and froze, a small handprint on the dusty glass framed by streaks of moss, but not dirt. Blood, dry, dark brown. Claire took off her glove and ran her thumb over the print. It felt gritty, like rust, but the faint metallic scent of iron still lingered in the air. She didn't scream. She just sat down slowly, back against the cold steel wall of the bus. Her heart pounded out of rhythm. Her ears buzzed. Claire closed her eyes in the half-dark of a school bus that hadn't moved in nearly 30 years. The pieces were starting to surface, but they hadn't clicked together. Not yet. She only knew one thing for sure. Agnes had been here, and she'd left something behind. Not out of fear, but out of hope that someone would come back. His name was Edward Hayes. He was the only surviving bus driver from Ash Hollow in 1996. Claire found him in a nursing home 20 miles outside town, living in a room with one window, which looked out toward the woods. He didn't recognize her right away. His face was thin. His eyes are cloudy. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Claire Whitaker," she said gently. "Agnes's foster daughter." The moment he heard the name, he stiffened. His hand trembled, spilling drops of tea onto his lap. "Agnes," he murmured. "She asked me once about the bus. Back then, I said nothing." Claire placed a photo from the library on the table, showing 5 children standing before a white, unmarked school bus. His gaze locked onto it. His breathing slowed. "I just need to know," Claire said, "what really happened." After a long silence, Hayes nodded slowly. His voice was rough, barely louder than a breath. "I was in Vietnam. My unit was ambushed. I made it out, but I never forgot that night. And there was another night here, just like it." Claire didn't speak. She just listened. "I was told to take the kids on a field trip that morning, 5 of them. The headmaster gave the order and said I should turn down the Western Trail, even though it wasn't on any mapped bus route. I pushed back. He looked at me like I didn't have a choice. When we arrived, another car was already waiting in the woods. 2 men in black, no names. They didn't talk much. One carried a large black bag that looked like a military medic kit. But it was heavy, real heavy. Claire gripped the side of her chair. "I wasn't allowed to watch the kids get off. I was told to look away, but I remember the boy, Sam." He turned around before stepping out. He said, "My sister's waiting out there. I have to go back." Hayes paused, his eyes welled. I don't know if Sam really had a sister, but his face. He didn't look like a kid heading to a picnic. He looked like someone who knew he wasn't coming back. Claire stood, nodded gratefully, and was ready to leave, but before she could exit, Mr. Hayes called after her. His hands shook as he pulled something from a drawer. A silver star-shaped pin etched with, "To Sam, be brave." "I found it under my driver's seat," he said. "Take it. It belonged to him." Back at her car, the sun was setting. Claire opened the driver's side door, placed her bag on the seat, and then froze. A plain white sheet of paper sat on the dashboard. No envelope. Block letters. Heavy, deliberate. "Stop, you will end up like them." The wind moved softly through the pine trees, cold, but it didn't make her flinch. Claire folded the paper neatly, slipped it into her coat pocket. "Too late," she whispered. Claire sat motionless in her car for over an hour after leaving the nursing home. The silver star-shaped pin Mr. Hayes had given her was still in her hand, cold, heavy, and silent. That night, she retrieved a small strand of hair tangled inside the collar of the jacket she had found on the bus. She had kept it from the first visit, not for any logical reason, just a feeling. Now she knew she needed an answer. Claire sent the hair sample to a private lab in Raleigh. She requested it be compared against her own DNA, a test she had never imagined needing. 3 days later, the results arrived. Relationship, sibling match 99, 87% probability. She read it 3 times, there was no mistake. That strand of hair belonged to her biological brother. Claire didn't cry, not immediately. She just sat in the wooden cabin, hands wrapped around a cup of cold tea. The wind whispered through the old tin roof, sounding like someone calling far away. Then an image surged back. Her birth mother, in a dim, flickering memory from when she was 3, was crying in a concrete hallway. A man in a white shirt held her back, and her mother whispered, "I'll take the girl, but the boy I can't." Claire had always thought it was just a dream. Now she knew it wasn't. She opened the bottom drawer of Agnes's old desk, which held all her papers, and there, taped to the underside, she found a worn envelope sealed with brittle medical tape. No name. Inside was a letter handwritten in Agnes's familiar script. "Claire, if you found this letter, it means my silence has reached its limit." Agnes detailed what she had witnessed in 1996. James was special. He drew his little sister every day, said her name was Claire even though they'd never met. "I thought he was making it up, until I found an old birth certificate hidden in the medical files. You had the same mother." Claire sat still, the letter trembling in her hands. "I tried to get James out, but they knew. They warned me. A week later, my medical bracelet vanished, and the next morning, James was gone from his room. I couldn't tell anyone. There was no proof, and you were still too young." The final line of the letter hit like a stone in the chest. "If you're reading this, forgive me. I saved one of you. But my heart stayed in those woods with James." Claire stood up, barely thinking. She drove straight to the rusted school bus and walked quickly down the aisle of rotted seats. This time, she knelt beside the second seat on the left where she had once seen the dried blood stain. Reaching into a tear in the old cushion, she pulled out a folded, ink-smeared piece of paper. It was a child's drawing. 2 kids, a boy and a girl, standing in front of a wooden cabin, hand in hand. Above them, written in blue ink, "My sister will find me." Claire sat down on the bus floor. No words, just tears. James had been waiting for 27 years, and now, finally, she had come. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She tore through the cabin desk drawers, closet corners, the attic crawl space where Agnes had once kept wooden boxes. Finally, beneath a warped floorboard, she found a sealed oak box wrapped with a copper wire, closed not with a lock but with aged beeswax. Etched into the lid, in shaky hand, carved letters, "Truth not safe yet." Claire opened it. Inside was a thick bundle of documents, sorted meticulously, letters, medical forms, internal reports. On top was an unsent letter addressed to State Attorney General, North Carolina, dated October 28, 1996. Agnes had written, "I, Agnes Whitaker, formerly a registered nurse at Ash Hollow School, report unlawful and inhumane conduct committed by the school's administration, specifically Headmaster Marshall Crane, and an entity known as the Ash Outreach Foundation. This foundation receives difficult-to-place or undocumented children and transfers them to third parties of unknown origin, with no paperwork, no oversight. I believe some of these children are missing, or worse, deceased." Claire felt the blood drain from her hands. That name Crane, she had seen it before in an old hallway portrait, now erased from public records. Suddenly a sound outside the window, soft, like footsteps brushing dry leaves. Claire switched off the light, sat still. Max lay at her feet, ears back, a quiet growl building in his chest. No knock, no shadow, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. She opened the lower compartment of the box. Inside, a faded Polaroid sealed in plastic. The image. The white bus. 5 children are standing in front, and in the background, in the shadows of the trees, a man in a light gray suit holding a clipboard. His face was obscured, half hidden by the tree line, but when Claire tilted the photo toward the light, the reflection caught on his chin and eyeglasses. Familiar. She pulled up a digital archive of Marshall Crane, compared the photos, identical. The photo had been taken on the very day the children disappeared, and he had been there. Claire didn't say another word. The next morning, she scanned everything, the photo, the documents, the DNA results, and sent them to a civil rights attorney in Raleigh known for handling abuse cases in the state's education system. She added a single note. "I don't know if anyone still wants to touch this, but I won't let it die again." On her drive back to the cabin, Claire stopped by the forest's edge, the same place she had first seen the bus. It had begun to drizzle. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine like a whisper. Claire closed her eyes. This time there was no question. Why me? Only one thought remained. How many other children were never named? 3 days after Claire sent the documents, the story exploded. The state's largest newspaper published a headline series titled, "The Bus That Never Came Back, 5 Missing Children, One Woman's Truth." Within hours, CNN, The Washington Post, and NPR picked up the story. The state governor released an official statement, ordering reopening the 1996 Ash Hollow case. A forensic team was dispatched to the forest, using ground-penetrating radar and drones to scan every inch of earth surrounding the rusted bus. The results came quickly. They found artifacts, a school badge fragment buried deep under moss, a child's button, a pair of tiny sneakers hidden behind a rock less than 20 steps from the bus, and a small bone sample. DNA confirmed it belonged to Sam Elkins, age 10. The town of Ashallow was stunned. Some people wept. Some remained silent. Some chose to leave town in the middle of the night. Claire didn't go on television. She gave no statements. She turned down every interview request. At dawn, before the sun was up, she came only once to place a bouquet of white flowers beneath the pine where the bus still rested. Beside the flowers lay Sam's poetry notebook sealed in plastic, still open to the last page. "My sister will come. She'll find me." A week later, a bronze memorial plaque was erected beside the bus, funded entirely by local donations raised in less than 48 hours. The plaque read, "This is where 5 children once waited to come home. Now they have finally been heard." Beneath were 5 names: James Whitaker, Sam Elkins, Naomi Joseph, Marcus Bell, Lydia Tran, and at the bottom, engraved in quiet lettering, "Because someone finally listened." Claire stood a few steps away, resting her hand on the name James, the brother she had never truly been allowed to call by name. There were no tears, just a feeling as if a severed artery had finally begun to pulse again. She whispered, "I came, James, and now everyone knows your name." Max sat silently beside her, his golden head resting on her knee. No one spoke, no one needed to. As Claire left the forest, the evening light slanted through the trees, spilling across the bus's metal shell where the moss had begun to fall away, as though time itself was finally allowing the truth to be seen one last time. A few weeks after the memorial, Claire returned to Charlotte, carrying an old cardboard box. Inside were the case files, the photos, the scanned DNA reports, and one item more precious than the rest, Sam's poetry notebook. She hadn't left it in the woods. She'd brought it home to begin something new. Claire rewrote the entire story, not as an investigation, not with headlines or sensational detail, just as the testimony of someone who once heard a call she didn't understand. The book was quietly published under the title, "The Bus That Never Came Back and the Girl Who Finally Did." During a classroom visit at a small middle school in Asheville, Claire stood before a group of 5th graders the same age Sam had been. She didn't tell them everything that had happened. She only said one thing: never think your story is too small to be heard. Someday, one of you might be the reason someone else's name is remembered. The video closes with Claire returning to the memorial on an autumn afternoon. She kneels and places a hand-drawn picture, the one James had made of 2 children standing before a cabin beneath the bronze plaque, sealed inside a clear sleeve. She whispers, "I kept my promise, James." The wind drifts softly through the pine trees, warm, gentle, no longer like weeping, just a goodbye. Some truths can't come to light until someone patient enough chooses to listen. Some names aren't truly lost, they're only waiting for someone to find them. If you believe truth still matters, that the quiet deserve to be remembered, join us at Humankind Stories to keep telling the stories that need to be heard. Subscribe, share, and help bring light back to where it once went dark.